Welcome back. We're getting new details on the Fort Hood shooter. Just about 30 minutes ago, Secretary of the Army John McHugh told a Senate panel that specialist Ivan Lopez was undergoing a variety of treatments for conditions ranging from depression to anxiety and sleep disturbance. He was prescribed some drugs to address these issues. Here's more.
He was seen just last month by a psychiatrist. He was fully examined. And as of this morning, we had no indication on the record of that examination that there was any sign of likely violence, either to himself or to others, no suicidal ideation. So the plan forward was to just continue to monitor and to treat him as deemed appropriate.
We are expecting a press conference from the doctors treating the wounded in the next hour. For now, let's talk to Don Borelli, an NBC News national security analyst. Dr. Devi Nampiaparampil is an assistant professor at New York University School of Medicine. And Dr. Devi directed the pain management programs at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Good morning to you both.
Morning.
Dr. Devi, let me start with you. There's a lot we know about PTSD, but even more that we don't know. The National Institute of Mental Health says it impacts 7.7 million Americans. What can you tell us within this context? Because you know some people will hear that he saw a psychiatrist, that he was being evaluated but had not been diagnosed, and people will ask the question, well, why didn't we know something might be coming?
Well, PTSD by itself, it doesn't make people violent. So you can't really predict if someone's going to become violent under these circumstances. It's impossible to know what's going on in their own mind. But the key with PTSD is to understand that the person has experienced a trauma, and so they're reliving that in their mind. So if he saw something while he was in Iraq and he's reliving that at that time, that might have predisposed him to violence. And at the same time, for the psychiatrist, you know, they're in a difficult position because you don't want to take away someone's freedoms. You don't want to hospitalize someone and say that they are violent or that they might hurt someone when you really don't know if that's going to happen. Things can change at any moment.
You hit on something that may be important here, because one of the things that we heard from Secretary McHugh was that his records show that he had no wounds, no direct involvement in combat, no record of Purple Heart activity, no record of any injury. But you say maybe it was something he saw, something he experienced that might have been outside personally getting involved in combat?
Well, that can happen because trauma is different for different people. So even now with this Fort Hood shooting, people who might not have been at the previous one may still be predisposed to developing PTSD now. So it's sort of what a person internalizes and then how they feel about it, how they respond to that trauma. Now, the VA is pretty good at bringing people in and trying to treat them. It's got a lot of resources for treating mental illness, but it's still very difficult without a cure for these types of symptoms.
And in the meantime, obviously, we all want to know what happened here, what was the motive here. And Don, the FBI has come in to work with Army officials on this investigation. What would they be doing right now? What's their focus? Because it's not like they're looking for a suspect. We know who did this, but we do want to know why.
We want to know why, exactly. And that's where the Army CID and the FBI will be working together to try to put the pieces together, looking at the crime scene, because that's perishable. They'll be looking to interview witnesses while their memory is fresh, victims to the extent that they can interview the victims that are healthy enough to be interviewed. They'll be doing a search warrant at the house, talking to family members, and anybody that might have had knowledge and could have predicted this. One of the key questions I would want to know is where did the gun come from? Why wasn't it registered? Who knew he had a weapon if he was having some mental issues? And if somebody knew that he had a weapon, why wasn't that brought to the attention of authorities? These are some of the early warning signs that you look at when assessing a workplace violence type situation, which this is a workplace violence situation. The workplace happens to be a military installation.
And a huge military installation. We also know that at least last night, investigators were talking to his wife. He was married, so that may provide some clues there.
Absolutely. Again, they're going to want to look for things that maybe could have been done to intervene earlier to prevent what happened, but the immediate thing right now is just to try to figure out why this happened and hopefully down the road learn from it.
They already have something of a timeline. They know that he went into one building, and at least, even though their alerts may have gone out, he got into his car and drove into a second location. Now, we don't know whether people were targeted, why he went from one building to the other, but one of the questions surely they'll look at is response time.
And of course, they will look at that. And this is, again, you mentioned this is a very huge installation. So, you know, response time, it's like it's a city essentially. So they'll look at the timeline to make sure it was appropriate. But especially after recent events in military installations, this is something that they train for, the active shooter scenario. And by all accounts, it looks like Fort Hood was ready for a situation like this, that they had the training, they'd talked through, you know, the what-if scenarios, and it was handled appropriately and timely.
One of the things that obviously we're going to look at as the days go forward, and we always do when there are these situations that involve military, Dr. Devi, is, as you pointed out, we don't have a direct correlation between PTSD and violence. If there are 7.7 million people, the vast majority of them will never become violent, although we know that we have seen these incidents, whether it's something major like this, something that's in a home. It's also going to bring up a lot of issues for people who were at that base 5 years ago for the Nidal Hassan shooting. And back then, the chain of command knew that there were mental health problems, and critics say that they didn't do enough to stop it. But talk to us about the broader price that we pay, not just in terms of something high profile like this, but for PTSD in general.
Well, we have a problem in this country because mental illness has so much stigma associated with it. So people who could come forward, you know, people who are suffering with nightmares, re-experiencing this trauma under tremendous pressure and anxiety, they actually stay away from the medical system sometimes because they don't want to get the stigma of mental illness. So that's one problem. The second thing is, you know, it's important to try to talk to people in the community. We try to talk to police also, that if someone calls you and says, you know, they're a veteran and they're having thoughts about harming someone else, that we don't want them to immediately feel like they're going to be arrested or in trouble. I mean, obviously you don't want anything bad to happen to the public, but you want to actually bring that person into a hospital setting or be supportive, because it's so important that that person themselves feels comfortable calling for help when something's happening.
Dr. Devi, important points. Thank you so much for being with us. NBC News national security analyst Don Borelli.